what happened in El Salvador was bad enough. It was about 70,000 killed, almost entirely the government-related security forces funded by the U.S., trained and armed by them. But the other countries were even worse. Guatemala was about 100,000, and Nicaragua maybe 30,000. Altogether, about 200,000 people killed in the 1980s. That was called a war on terror. Ronald Reagan came into office in 1981 and declared that the core function of U.S. foreign policy would be to combat the plague of the modern age, return to barbarism in our time, namely state-supported international terrorism. That episode has kind of been disappeared from history, to borrow the Latin American transitive verb, disappear. It's been eliminated. Kind of wrong story, wrong agency, not the right kind of thing to remember. It goes back much before that. This war on the murder of the Jesuit intellectuals in 1989 terminated a long campaign of terror and brutality that started in the early 1960s. It started actually with Vatican II. Vatican II in 1962 was an attempt by the Pope John XXIII, to institute a really radical change in church history. As you probably know, he tried to restore the church of early Christianity, the Gospels, what they actually say, a message of radical pacifism, which is, of course, why the early Christians were persecuted. That changed in the 4th century when the Roman Empire took over the church, made it the church of the persecutors, not the church of the persecuted, in the phrase of distinguished theologian Hans Küng, one of those punished in the period of the 60s and 70s. He wasn't killed. He was just kind of kept from teaching and so on. He was lucky. In 1962, at Vatican II, the Pope declared an effort to return the church to its original mission, to be the church of the persecuted. A very significant change. And it was taken seriously, particularly in Latin America. The Latin American bishops adopted that program. They adopted what was called the preferential option for the poor. Message comes out of the Gospels. And priests and nuns, laypersons, went to the countryside, tried to organize peasants into base communities where they would read the Gospels, think about ways to adopt measures to survive somehow in the extremely harsh domains of U.S. power. That was a heresy that was not going to be tolerated. The U.S. very quickly launched a war against the church. The church and all social movements that were participating in these similar efforts. It began very quickly in 1964. A military coup took place in Brazil, overthrowing the civilian government that had actually been prepared by the Kennedy administration, carried out shortly after Kennedy's assassination. That established what was called a national security state, kind of a neo-Nazi style terror and torture state. Brazil's a big country, a big influence. A plague spread through the hemisphere. Chile, Uruguay, Argentina, one country after another, similar phenomena, plenty of religious martyrs because they were in the forefront. And it continued through Central America in the 1980s. It essentially terminated with the murder of the 6 Jesuit intellectuals in November 1989, right at the time of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Well, it's well known to scholarship that the terror and atrocities and brutality and slaughter in Latin America from 1960 to the end of the century were incomparably worse than anything that happened in Eastern Europe in those years. What happened in Eastern Europe was bad enough, but what went on in Western domains was incomparably worse. Now, that's known to scholarship. For example, you can read it in the recently published at Cambridge University History of the Cold War, kind of comment on it. But it's not known to the public. What's known to the public is the suffering of the East European dissidents, which was real, and they should be respected and honored. But in comparison with what was happening elsewhere, they were pretty lucky, far luckier than the Jesuits of El Salvador or the Archbishop or many others during those years. Well, one of the task of intellectuals is to ensure that we know about the East European dissidents, and we pride ourselves on our heroism in supporting them, but we don't know about the ones who we slaughtered and tortured and killed. That's out of history, not to be remembered. I happened to be in Europe in November 2009 at the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall, and there was a great deal of euphoria, self-congratulation about our great courage in supporting dissidents in the enemy's domain, but there wasn't a word about what happened in Latin America, primarily carried out by the United States, but with the strong support of its European allies all the way through. Well, that's a typical task of the intellectuals. If you go back to, say, the Vietnam War, there was protest, substantial protest, mostly on the part of young people, students, people outside the elite intellectual circles. There was some protest there, but very muted and quite interesting in its character. I've written about it if you want the details. Up through the early years of the war, there was overwhelmingly strong support for the war. There was virtually no protest. In fact, support for the war was so strong that very few people, even today, know when the war began. It actually began just 50 years ago. In 1961, President Kennedy at the time, sent the American Air Force to start bombing South Vietnam, authorized the use of napalm, chemical warfare to destroy crops and ground cover, programs to drive the rural population, which was overwhelmingly supportive of the guerrillas, as they knew, to drive them into what amounted to concentration camps called strategic hamlets, to surround them with barbed wire, to protect them from the guerrillas who they were strongly supporting. It ended up with millions of people being driven out. I don't have to describe what happened to South Vietnam. Was virtually destroyed. The war expanded to the rest of Indochina, always with European support and with virtually no criticism. By about 1966 or 67, there were few voices of criticism in educated circles on the grounds that it was not working very well. Same kind of grounds you hear today in Afghanistan, or you heard a couple of years ago about Iraq. It wasn't working too well, maybe it was a mistake. In 1968, everything changed. In January 1968, there was an amazing uprising in South Vietnam. There's been nothing like it in history. The country was saturated with over 500,000 American troops, over 100,000 Thai, Korean, other mercenaries, huge army, 700,000 or 800,000 people. Every village penetrated, informants everywhere. All of a sudden, in January 1968, there was an uprising which no one knew about. Everyone had kept quiet, and it was all over the country. Practically, I broke into the American embassy, This is the Tet Offensive. I don't think there's ever been a case of such overwhelming commitment to a revolutionary cause. No one even talked about it, and it was a surprise everywhere. Well, that struck a chord with the American business community, the ones who are decisive in determining policy. It got them to recognize that this war isn't worth fighting any longer. We've basically won our objectives. It's a waste of money and time. And they pressured the government, a pretty strong power play, to reverse policy. And the government did follow orders, reversed policy, started withdrawing troops, entered in negotiations. The president announced that he's not going to run for a second term, and so on. The intellectuals responded almost reflexively. All of a sudden, everybody became a long-term opponent of the war without any trace that anyone can find. In fact, the record says the opposite. But that was the new party line. We're long-term opponents of the war, got to get out, it was a mistake, shouldn't have gotten in, and so on. There are a number of leading figures in the Kennedy administration who wrote memoirs. Arthur Schlesinger, Roger Hilsman, Theodore Sorensen, others. They rewrote their memoirs, literally. The early memoirs, the ones written at the time, if you look at them, were fully supportive of the war, or often didn't even mention it because it was so uninteresting. The post-1968 story, which is the one that enters into history, is Kennedy was going to pull out of Vietnam. Everybody was opposed. It should have never gotten in the first place. It's the bad Texan, Lyndon Johnson, who turned everything around. And we, the intellectuals, were passionate opponents of the war. We couldn't make our case. That's the more or less official story today. There is, by now, if you go to 1975, when the war officially ended, it's quite interesting to look at what was being written then and what popular attitudes were then. At that time, among the public, about 70% of the population in polls said that the war was not a mistake. It was fundamentally wrong and immoral. That's 70% of the population. Not a phrase like that in the educated community. In fact, at the outside limits of criticism, say in the New York Times, the most dissident journalist, Anthony Lewis, wrote that the war began